Well, I have to begin by confession, and what a terrible person I really am. You'll notice how well Brian pronounced Elimelech. Well, he was concerned about that earlier before the service, and it came to my attention that he was concerned. So being the kind and caring person that I am, every time I'd walk by Brian, I'd say something about Naomi and her husband Eliminate. But he overcame, and you did good. So that's the kind of person I am. So pray for me. I need it. Well, the book of Ruth is all about God's provision, how he provides for his people in good times and in bad. We've all had good times and bad times, haven't we? Sure we have. And I think for most of us, maybe I shouldn't be so pessimistic, but I think maybe I'll say for many of us, there have been times in our lives where we felt like we had hit rock bottom. It just couldn't get any worse. And that's where our story opens this morning. Back up to the last verse in chapter 1. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of harvest. Now you will remember when Naomi left Bethlehem to go to Moab, she left with pretty much everything in her life intact. She had a husband who we assume she loved and he loved her. She had 2 adult sons, which in that time and that place was very important, because you needed to have some sons to take care of you when you got a little older. They go into Moab. Things are looking pretty well. They find food there. You remember that's why they left. It's because there was a famine in Bethlehem. And they found food. Life is good. The 2 sons find wives and marry. Great. Now she's surrounded by family. Everything's looking good. And then lo and behold, her husband dies. And then about 10 years later, both of her sons die. Now, she's a widow in a foreign land with 2 daughter-in-laws that she's responsible for. What's she going to do? So she says, well, we'll go back to Bethlehem. She had heard a rumor that the famine was over in that part of the world, and she could go back now. So she starts back, and her 2 daughters-in-laws are going to go with her. But then she tells them, and you remember we talked a little bit about what her possible motives could have been, but she tells the daughters, no, don't come with me. You stay here in your land, and I will return to my land. And you remember we talked a little bit about the subject of racism there. And it was much worse then than it is now, and it's bad now. But if you were a foreigner and you're coming into another country, you're not going to be welcomed with open arms, especially if you're just a woman. Now, don't get mad at poor old Pastor Darrell. I like women. I do. But in those days, you see, they were more considered chattel than anything else. And so if you were a single woman, you had lots of problems to deal with. I just want us to understand the setting that was going on there. So she tells her 2 daughters-in-law, no, you guys stay here in Moab because you'll be better off here. Perhaps you can even find you some husbands. No self-respecting Israeli is going to want to marry a Moabitess. And we talked a little bit about the background between the 2 countries and the enmity that existed within them. So, as we know, Orpah says, okay, I'll stay here. And Naomi clings to her. And she gives that famous verse, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God. Your people will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Now, in other words, she's committing herself totally to Naomi. She's going to go to her grave serving and following after Naomi. Well, now to make matters worse, in a sense, things are going well in Bethlehem. We say, well, how can that make matters worse? Well, think about how we feel inside. Think about our emotions. Think about how Naomi had left this place when everybody was struggling and went out to make a great life for herself, which fell completely apart. And now she has to return, and everybody around her now is prospering. It's the time of the barley harvest. And is there anything worse than you being struggling and be surrounded by people that are all doing just fine? That's hard to take. It's hard for us to. We want to say, God, where are you in all of this? And I'm sure Naomi was struggling with that. Naomi left with everything, returns with nothing, and now she really has no hope. Naomi has hit rock bottom. Now, for those of you that have been there, you know that feeling. And maybe some of you feel like you're there right now. And if you do, I have a word of encouragement for you. Rock bottom is a solid foundation to build on. When you've hit rock bottom, you can't go any further down, but you can build on that solid rock. Now, that bit of wisdom didn't come from me. It came from Dr. Rick Rigsby. And if you've never heard him speak, you should Google him. He wrote a book called Wisdom from a Third Grade Dropout, or What I Learned from a Third Grade Dropout. It's a great book. You can just Google any of that up there and he'll come up. And he's just a great guy. But anyway, now Naomi has a good foundation to build on. Let's see how that building process goes. Well, it's certainly going to involve Ruth, but how much help can Ruth be? Ruth turned her back on everything familiar to her, her homeland, her country, her relatives, and has committed herself to Naomi. So let's see how this plays out for these two very different women. Where are you, God? I'm sure that's a question both of them could be asking. Naomi may be asking it in the sense that, I've served you all my life. Where are you? Ruth may be asking the question in the sense that, I turned my back on my gods and I've embraced you. Why aren't you helping me? Theologians call this the dark night of the soul, when there's no hope, there's nothing left. And it is here, in this dark place, that we imagine. Our imagination starts working, and it's never good. We worry. We worry about this possible scenario, that scenario. We persuade ourselves God has abandoned us, and we have no hope. You've probably been there at some point in your life. I want you to notice the role reversal that's going on here between Naomi and Ruth. Naomi should be the decision maker. Naomi should be the one providing for Ruth. Because again, hierarchy was very important in those days, and she was the head of the clan now. But no, Ruth is going to start ministering to Naomi and start taking care of Naomi's needs. They are in the same situation, correct? They're in the same place, the same time, with the same problems, except Ruth has even bigger problems than Naomi because Ruth is a foreigner. The Israelites hate the Moabites. Every place she goes, she's going to carry that stigma. And yet, even though Ruth has it worse than Naomi, we see that Naomi loses heart and Ruth takes heart. To Naomi, it seems like she has succumbed, given up to the circumstances, to the situation, whatever. There's no hope. It's never going to get any better. Maybe best case scenario, I can get Ruth to go out and glean in the fields and maybe bring us home some scraps of food or whatever we can get. Ruth, on the other hand, takes heart, steps out in faith that she will be able to find a spot among the many other gleaners and with a kind landowner. This is verse 1 and 2. Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth, the Moabite, said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I will find favor." And so she said to her, "Go, my daughter." Notice it was Ruth that initiated going out into the fields. Now again, we have to understand the situation there. When this Moabitess, this foreigner, goes out into the field, she's a single woman. We're going to assume she's still relatively young. And she's out there by herself with no one to protect her, with all these guys, none of whom have been to sensitivity training yet. Very precarious position for a young woman. Not comfortable at all. But she volunteers to go. So she's going to go out and she's going to glean. Well, what's this gleaning thing all about? It was instigated by God in Leviticus chapter 19, verses 9 and 10, if you want to read it for yourselves. And it simply is, God is telling the landowners, the farmers, not to keep it all for themselves. When you harvest your fields, you intentionally don't harvest the outside rows. You intentionally don't make sure you pick up every last stalk of grain. You leave that so people that are hungry can come and glean, in other words, pick up what's there. It's a very good program. It was a work program for the poor. And as I was thinking about this, I thought, well, boy, we could learn from that in our society today. And I thought of the WPA. And if you've ever done much hiking or been out in the woods and around, you've seen these little stamps where it says, "Built by the WPA," you know. And that was the thing, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt instituted that. It was mainly designed by a guy named Harry Hopkins, who was one of Roosevelt's right-hand men. But anyway, the WPA was a place where people could go and work and get paid for their work. They'd do various public service projects and that sort of thing. And that way they could buy something to eat. It wasn't a welfare program in the sense that you did nothing and just showed up. You showed up and you worked. And that way you not only got food for your body, your physical needs, but you got food for your soul. You could feel good about yourself. You had done something. And that's straight out of Leviticus. Well, where are you, God? Now, God begins to answer the question here. And the first thing he provides is, he provides some divine guidance. Verses 3 through 7. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened, I love that, it just happened, coincidentally, she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered him, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" Notice, not who is this woman. Whose young woman is this? She must belong to somebody. She's chattel. So that's important to know. And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." Divine guidance. Ruth stepped out in faith that somebody would let her glean in her field. Now, there was a big chance that they wouldn't, because after all, these are Israeli fields, Israelite fields. They are for Israelite people. You Moabites, no Moabites need apply. But she had faith that God would provide, that God would lead her. She had faith that somehow God would protect her. She wouldn't be molested, she wouldn't be harmed, but she would be able to go about the business of gleaning. So Ruth steps out and God directs. The psalmist says in Psalm 16, verse 9, "The heart of man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps." And I use this illustration often, but you ever notice it's much easier to turn the wheels on a moving car than it is one that's sitting still. So when you step out, God begins to guide. And you may step out and think, well, this is the way to go. I'm going to have faith that God wants me to go there, and God may turn you clear around and take you over here. You don't know, but God will get you where he wants you to be. And you will have opportunity to serve him where he wants you to serve, if you have a servant's heart. But if you don't step out, if you don't have a servant's heart, how will you know? Now, God has also made another appointment here. Notice in verse 4, "And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem." Boaz comes to check on his field and the progress of his harvest just at the time that Ruth happens to be there working. And he inquires, "Who is this?" Well, he said, "Whose is this?" And his man tells him that it's Ruth, the Moabitess. Now, we also see something in here about Boaz's character. You back up to verse 4, when Boaz approached the field, "Behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to his reapers, 'The Lord be with you.' And they answered, 'The Lord bless you.'" Here we have, I want to say a Christian man, but Christ hadn't come yet. But we had a man serving God who let his employees know he served God, and his employees were serving God, and they would ask God to bless each other. So we know now that Boaz has a good heart, a godly heart. And we know that he has staffed his farm with godly workers. Now, this is going to be a much better environment for Ruth to be able to operate in. But now verses 5 through 7 tell us something about Ruth's character. "Then Boaz said to his young man, who was in charge of the reapers, 'Whose young woman is this?' And the servant who was in charge of the reapers said, 'She is the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from Moab.' She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers.' So she came and has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest." It tells us Naomi was serious about her job. Even though she's not working for him, she's working to eat, and she was going to do all she could do. She was a good, hard worker. Well, we have some divine guidance. We've got God directing Ruth to the fields. We've got God directing Boaz to be there right at the time Ruth is there. And so we begin to see God's divine provision. God does not just lead Ruth to any field. He led her to Boaz's field. God doesn't just willy-nilly lead us to various places to see what will happen. No, God leads us to specific places so we can make things happen for him. Ruth, because she stepped out and because she followed God's leading, will not just get food, but she's going to get something that it was very surprising, very improbable that she ever would have received, and we see it here in verse 8, Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." Ruth is going to get respect as a person. Notice he didn't say, "Now listen, daughter of Moab," or "Now listen, you Moabites." He didn't even say, "Listen, daughter-in-law of Naomi." He said, "Listen, my daughter." He recognized her as a fellow human being trying to make her way through life just as he was. Now, he was having a lot easier time of it, but we don't know how hard he worked to get there either. He probably put in a lot of time and effort. But he, instead of putting her down with a racial slur or whatever, he lifts her up by calling her my daughter. Now, I can just imagine that the people around were kind of picking up on that too. Oh, that's how he thinks of her? Well, I better not be throwing racial slurs around at her because he's the boss. So maybe I'd better elevate my thinking a little bit. You see, we do affect other people by how we conduct ourselves. She will not just get food, but she will get respect, and she will get protection. She is not that foreigner, but she is to Boaz, my daughter. How often, and I hope not often, but how often are we guilty of dehumanizing those who may be different from us by referring to them as, oh, they're just those people, whoever those people are. You know, maybe they're, when I first moved to Oregon, I was one of those people. I was from California. Well, then I moved to Washington, and I was still one of those people, because now I was from Oregon. The Oregonians are just running in Washington, you know. Yeah, well, then I'm really in trouble. I'm an American then. Yeah. But you see, we dehumanize people, and the sermon isn't a message on race, but it's about how we treat other people. See? Because not everyone is a member of God's family. But everyone bears the image of God. You see? And so we're to respect that in all peoples. See? God has certainly blessed Ruth. But you know what? The thing about God is, when the tide begins to turn from you thinking he's not even involved, to him beginning to bless you, oftentimes the floodgates of blessing just burst open. And he continues to bless you. And that's what we see happening here. We'll pick it up in verse 9. Let your eyes, he's talking to Ruth now, let your eyes be on the field that you are reaping, and go after them. Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? Again, safety. For a young woman, safety would have been paramount. And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn. Now she's got water provided for her. Do you think an Israeli would let a Moabite woman drink from the water they gathered? No way. And I'm not putting down the Israelis here. I mean, that's the way it was in the world at that time. That was just life. So now she's got water. Then she fell down on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" Now, shouldn't that be our response to Christ? That we should just fall on our face and say, "Why on earth did you take notice of me?" But Boaz answered her, all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. Now, see, Boaz is theologically astute here. He knows that she didn't just come to be under his protection. She's under God's protection. Then she said, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants. You see, again, she recognizes that she's not part of the in crowd. She's from the outcasts, the foreigners. And at mealtime, it gets even better. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, come here and eat some bread and dip your morsel in the wine. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied. Now, that's not a big deal for us. We can read that passage and not think much about it because we get satisfied almost every time we eat. Sometimes too satisfied. But for a person that's been starving, this is a big deal. She's had enough to eat, possibly for the first time in months. And she had some left over. Wow. Kind of reminds me of the story of the loaves and the fishes. And they had more left over after they'd given away what they had than they had before. When she rose to glean, and now it gets better yet, Boaz instructed his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. And also, pull out some bundles for her and leave for her to glean. And do not rebuke her. Wow. When God starts to bless, the windows of heaven open and the blessings pour out. God is using Boaz as his instrument of blessing to Ruth. He provides her with physical safety. He provides her with self-respect. He provides her with water. He provides her with food. And on it goes. And she had none of these things 24 hours before this. Boaz, you will notice when she went out, she was in hopes that she could find not just a field to glean in, but a field that was owned by a godly man. Tell you why that was so important. Because every landowner adhered to the law of gleaning. But as with all laws, when human beings get a hold of them, they can be twisted, they can be interpreted differently, and believe me, not everybody that owned a field was all excited about not harvesting the outside rows. They would fudge on that a little bit. And they weren't all that excited about having these usually outcasts picking up their grain and stuff, so they wouldn't be so generous. But she goes to Boaz, and Boaz interprets the law of Leviticus, the laws of gleaning, with a kind and generous heart. And he says, I won't just fulfill the letter of the law, I will go over and above the law because God has blessed me with so much. Why can I not be generous to those who have nothing? Wow. If we should all live like that. And that's where God puts Ruth down, right in the middle of all of that blessing. There's much we can learn here. God sent Boaz at just the right moment to meet with Ruth. And as I was thinking about that, Boaz, speaking physically here, is going to be Ruth's provider. He's going to be Ruth's protector. And I thought, at just the right point in time, Paul, in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his Son to be born of a woman under the law. Boaz is most certainly a type of Christ, in that at just the right time, God connected him with Ruth. At just the right time, Jesus Christ was born into this world. And at just the right time, God connected us with him. And he, Jesus, became our provider. He became our protector. He became our shield and our strength. Well, let's look at Ruth's response. A grateful heart. She asked Boaz in verse 10, "Why me?" Boaz's response, "I have heard what you have done for your mother-in-law." You see, Ruth's reputation had preceded her. Remember, Naomi's heart was bitter and depressed. And I understand that. I get it. And I think we can all understand it. We can all identify with Naomi. Yet Ruth remained true to her commitment. Do you suppose living with Naomi from the time all the bad stuff started happening until now has been a pleasant experience for Ruth? You ever been around people that are depressed, manic depressive, bipolar, that sort of thing? Hell on earth, believe me. It's terrible. And people walk off every day from those situations. But not Ruth. Ruth clung to Naomi. You remember we talked about that word clung, I think in the very first message. It's the same word, same Hebrew word we find in Genesis when it says a man shall leave his mother and father and cling to his wife. Ruth would not be dissuaded. And she took this same attitude into the field with her. She showed up early. She worked hard. And I can see Ruth, as she takes in what's going on, Boaz telling the guys to make it as easy for her as possible. And she could have said to herself, well, I can just kind of coast here. You know, I don't have to do any of the dirty work. I'll just take the best. But that's not Ruth, is it? I think what Ruth thought to herself was, wow, this guy's going the extra mile for me. I'm going to go the extra mile for him. I'm going to work really hard. I think that's the way Ruth was built. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 31, it says, whatsoever you eat, whatsoever you drink, do all unto the glory of God. And that's the kind of attitudes we should have. Whatever we're doing, do it all to the glory of God. Do it the best we can with what we have. Well, it's now evening. And we see in verse 17, so Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. How exciting is that? Don't you guys just get excited about ephahs? Probably not. You probably don't spend a lot of time talking about them. But had you lived then and you were hungry, you would get excited about an ephah. Because an ephah is equal to approximately 6 gallons. Now, 6 gallons of grain between two women will feed them for a while. And she did this in just one day. So again, we see God going over the top with providing for her. Remember, Elimelech and Naomi left because they were hungry. Life had been hard. Now at best they were facing a subsistence existence, and God provides. He didn't just provide enough for dinner that night. He provided for about a month's worth of dinners. Now we can see, I can imagine them thinking, well, we get 6 gallons in one day. 6 gallons is about a month's worth. We keep this up. We can set up a little business over here on the side. We can sell some of the excess. We're going to be fine. Life is going to be good again. Now, that's all speculation on my part, but I can see that happening. But it gets better. Pick it up here in verse 19. And her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you glean today, and where have you worked? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked and said, "This man's name with whom I work today is Boaz." And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi also said to her, "The man is a close relative of ours, one of our redeemers." Redeemer. There's a word we're familiar with, isn't it? Redeemer. There's another law you can read about in Leviticus chapter 25 if you like, and it's called the law of the kinsman redeemer. And I'm not going to get into all the details about it, but basically it said this. It was a law to protect women whose husbands had died and they're left a widow. And we know now that's a bad situation. Well, the law of the kinsman redeemer said that if your husband died and he had a brother, the brother should marry you, and you would have sons with the brother, and the brother would take care of you. Now, that cuts against our grain a little bit because of the way our society is. We don't do things like that anymore. But this was 3,000 years ago, okay? And that's, again, we see God making provision for the helpless. And then you kept stepping away until you found a relative close enough that was willing to step in and take care of you. So we'll talk more about that as we get into chapter 3. But Naomi is all excited here because Boaz is this distant relative, which makes him eligible to be Ruth's redeemer. Golly gee, again, how can you not see Jesus? Is he not our distant relative in the sense that he was born of a woman? Yeah, he is. Is he not our Redeemer because he is very God of very God? Yes, he is. Now you may say, well, there's a long way between me and Jesus. Yeah, there probably is. But it didn't stop Jesus from redeeming us. Ruth has done all she could do. She did her best. And what did she do? Not much, really. She stayed true to her commitment. She went out in the field and gathered up some grain. None of that's rocket science. Anybody could do that. And that's the way it is in God's kingdom. And most of the things he tells us to do don't require anything special. They don't require us to have a lot of money, a lot of education, a lot of anything. Now, if we have all that stuff, even better. But we can still be true to our commitments. We can still see people as image bearers of God. We can still be godly people. But there's still a problem. Isn't that always the way it is? No matter how good it is, there's always a problem hiding in there somewhere. And we find the problem in the very last verse of this chapter. So she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. You see the problem? She still has no home of her own. She still has no husband. She still really has no great future other than working every day and providing for her mother-in-law. Now, those are good things. But as a young woman, and then she's continually referred to as a young woman, don't you think deep down in her heart she would like to have a husband? She would like to have maybe some children? She would like that warmth and companionship? Of course she would. Of course she would. But she doesn't have it. She was a foreigner. The chances of somebody marrying her are slim. She's an outsider. Who would want her? Basically, no one. But she has a Redeemer. She has a Redeemer, and his name is Boaz. In many ways, and we'll flesh all that out next week. In many ways, Ruth's story is our story. As we live our lives, trying the best we can, we go through good times and bad, sad times and glad. Sometimes we ask, God, where are you? God, when are you going to show up? God, I've done this, that, and the other thing for you. Where are you? You ever do that? You ever list some of the things you've done for God? I wonder how he feels about that. But it's human nature. It's what we do. Sometimes we lose sight that God is with us through both the good times and the bad times. You see, God did more than just send Boaz / Jesus to make our lives better. Jesus didn't redeem us in order that we might live life here more comfortably, though that may happen. But that's not the purpose for our redemption. Our redemption isn't so trivial to be simply we're going to live life better here. Our redemption is for the purpose of eternal life forever with Christ. You see, it just gets better and better. And I have no idea how good it's going to get because I can't imagine that thing. You know, Paul tells us what eye has not seen, ear has not heard, the man cannot imagine what treasures Christ has stored up for us in eternity. God sent Boaz to Ruth, Jesus to us, to redeem us from the curse of death. Again, let me take you to Galatians chapter 4. I'll start in verse 4. But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, an heir through Jesus Christ. It's amazing. Absolutely amazing. You and I and Ruth have been redeemed. It's another song. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it. Redeemed by the blood of the Lamb. Redeemed, redeemed. Praise God, I've been redeemed. That can be our song. You know? We have a kinsman redeemer. And his name is Jesus. A name that is above every name. Pray with me. Father, thank you so much for your provision for us. And yes, God, we are thankful for the physical provisions you make. We are thankful that we have jobs and homes and cars and all those things. But Lord, let us move beyond that to being thankful for our salvation, for our redemption, and to remember, especially as this Thanksgiving approaches, to give thanks to you for coming to this earth, for being born, for living and dying, and most importantly, for on the third day rising, that we, foreigners, we who have nothing to offer, we who should be, all creatures be offensive to you, you redeemed us, you adopted us, and now you call us sons and daughters. Thank you, O God. In Jesus' name, amen.
If you're able, stand as we take the offering and just sing this one last song today.